Welcome to the Haunted Half Moon Inn. Tales from the Half Moon Inn presents Scary Stories, The Spooky Squad. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. Felicity stoked the fire in the living room fireplace of the old part of her house. A thunderstorm roared outside. At 62 degrees outside, it was just warm enough for a thunderstorm to form, and just cool enough to utilize the aged fireplace. Although this original section of the old house was still in need of a lot of renovation before anyone could live in it, the living room offered the perfect setting for the spooky squad. It gave us some privacy away from the confined apartment area of the addition to the original house where Felicity and her family lived. Felicity, Dan, Christina, and I were excited to launch what we hoped would become a weekly tradition. Friday Night Frights with the Spooky Squad offered us the chance to forget about our stresses for a time. Telling true and fictional scary stories was something that we had all been looking forward to since we came up with the idea last week. Sharing ghost stories and horror stories is always fun, but is there anything cooler than telling them in a real-life haunted house? Felicity kicked off the first official gathering of the Spooky Squad by telling us all about the fearful afternoon that she had before we all came over. We sat around the fireplace as Felicity told us about how she lost her phone only to find it in the unused kitchen in the original section of the house. Goosebumps activated when she described how her home security system went off and told her that she wasn't alone. Something was in the house, and that something was always there. We were all transfixed as she recounted her mysterious and frightening experience. Although Felicity explained that the alarm was probably triggered by a malfunction or by some mischievous hacker pulling a prank, I was increasingly becoming more convinced that the house was haunted. Very haunted. Sitting on the love seat with Dan, Christina began to share a creepy experience that she had freshman year. Amanda, Misty, and I were having a sleepover at Bridget's house. Misty asked if we had heard about the light as a feather game. We shrugged and asked what it was. Misty explained that it was easy to do and that she demonstrated for us. She asked me to lay down on the floor. Then Misty barely touched me with her fingertips on the left side, and Bridget and Amanda did the same on my right side. We all closed our eyes as they began to repeatedly chant, "Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board." After about 5 minutes, I felt myself gently rising above the floor. I couldn't believe it, but I must have been 6 inches off of the floor. I had amazingly been lifted off of the floor by their fingertips. "Are you serious?" Felicity questioned while squinting. "For real. It was crazy. We were both excited and creeped out," answered Christina as her hair fell over her eyes as she nodded her head. "Magic or levitation or what?" I asked. "Yes," responded Christina with a laugh. "Speaking of magic," said Dan as he leaned forward towards the fire. "Last fall I went to a party out in the woods of Junction Ridge. It was a secluded spot off of Old Black Horse Road. Billy Scott's older brother got a pony keg for the party. A bunch of people from school were there. It had gotten to be pretty late, and me and Billy wandered off to explore a bit. I'm not sure how far or long we walked, but it was far enough for the voices from the party to sound faded. Shining my flashlight, I was struck by the appearance of a huge, gnarly old oak tree. It had a creepy vibe to it. It must have been hundreds of years old. Then, a few feet in front of the tree, I saw that someone had painted a pentagram in red. A rotted tree stump appeared to have been fashioned into some kind of satanic altar. Animal bones littered the area around it. The skeletons looked like they belonged to cats and dogs. We heard footsteps in the autumn leaves. We called out, but nobody responded. I don't know if someone was watching us or if an animal was doing its thing, but we didn't stick around long. Whatever went on there was sick and totally messed up. What in the world? Satanists that sacrifice pets? Is Junction Ridge really that messed up? Felicity asked as her face had become strained. Junction Ridge, despite its quaint rustic charm, seems to have a darkness about it, Dan answered as he took a sip of coffee. Well, to be fair, every town has a mix of good and bad, Christina remarked while smiling at Felicity. The upstairs toilet flushed. Felicity went upstairs to see if anyone was in the bathroom. Yet again, there was no one upstairs, and the toilet had flushed of its own accord. Christina grabbed Dan's arm, and my eyes grew large as I looked into the fire. After Felicity came back downstairs, I shared the following story with the Spooky Squad. I've heard that a witch lives here in Junction Ridge. One night after midnight, a woman wearing a long black dress was seen floating a foot off of the pavement as she went down Hilltop Road. Get out of here. A witch floating down the road? That's totally ridiculous, said Felicity. I'm neither confirming nor denying the story. I'm just telling you what people say, I said as I shrugged my shoulders. My mom's friend got out of work one night, and on her way home she had to pull over to the side of the road because she had had a flat tire. Now, this was the early 1990s, so people didn't have cell phones yet. If you had a flat tire, you had to fix it yourself, start walking towards a gas station, or wait for someone to stop and help you, Felicity explained. My mom's friend was in luck. As she was checking her tires, a police officer happened to have been passing by, and he stopped to help her. The policeman was very nice and changed her tire for her. He asked my mom's friend if she knew how she had gotten the flat tire. She told him that she had no idea. The policeman then told her that the tire had clearly been stabbed with a knife. Ordinarily, this kind of thing is the work of teenage pranksters and vandals. Maybe that's all it was in this case. Then again, this wasn't an ordinary time in the low country of South Carolina. You see, in the 80s and 90s, a lot of young women were going missing in coastal South Carolina. More than a few mutilated corpses were turning up in the coastal marshes. Tragically, these dead bodies often belonged to girls who had been reported missing. These poor, innocent murder victims had some things in common. They were all between 16 and 30 years old, thin, pretty, and had black hair. These young girls were sexually assaulted and brutally murdered, and not necessarily in that order. This was the wicked work of a particularly sadistic serial killer. This psychopath stalked the nights in the Lowcountry looking for innocent girls to become his prey. He was dubbed the Lowcountry Butcher. A beautiful young girl with silky, shoulder-length black hair worked at a video rental store in the suburbs of Charleston. Her name was Stacy, and her shift was usually 3 p.m. till close at 11 p.m. On a hot and humid summer night in late June, she locked up the store and walked towards her car. While approaching the driver's side door, she called out, "Dang it, I forgot my umbrella in the store." Stacy quickly returned to the store and disappeared into the back office. A few minutes later, with her umbrella in hand, she returned to her car. The feeling of being watched crept over her. It was nighttime, and the fact that there was a notorious serial killer on the loose had all the young women of the coastal Carolinas on edge. Stacy got into her car and headed towards her apartment as she normally did after finishing work. The car began to pull to the side, and she could hear the tire making an unpleasant and undesired sound. It was obvious that she had a flat tire, and she had to pull over to the side of the road. This stretch of road was dark and surrounded by a forest. She got out of the car and confirmed that it was a flat tire. Stranded on the side of the road and surrounded by darkness and the wilderness, she was isolated. A young woman never wants to be in this position. With no phone, there's no way to call for help. She was apparently on her own. Bright headlights appeared and a car slowed down to a crawl and then stopped about 5 yards from the bumper of her car. 2 black boots stepped out of the car. A tall, slim, strange man slowly walked towards her and said, "Looks like you're having car troubles. Let me give you a hand." "Okay, thanks. That would be great," replied Stacy as she nervously stood by her car. "Do you have a spare tire in your trunk?" the man asked as he walked closer. "I think so. Let me check," Stacy replied as she unlatched the trunk from inside the car. The stranger crept towards her as she opened her trunk. He now had a large knife in his right hand. This stranger was the Lowcountry Butcher, and he was on the prowl. Stacy was his intended prey. She was in grave danger. The psychotic butcher commanded her to stay still so he could tie her hands up. "Freeze! Put your knife down, now!" Stacy yelled as she drew her gun on the butcher. The deranged serial killer was shocked. He had gone from being the hunter to being the hunted. As Stacy ordered him to put his knife down, an army of police officers converged on the scene from the woods. Stacy slapped handcuffs on him as the South Carolina police arrested him and threw him in jail. What the butcher didn't know was that Stacy was an undercover policewoman. With the help of a criminal profiler, the police had learned the modus operandi of the Lowcountry Butcher. They used this knowledge to set up a sting operation to catch him. Stacy went undercover and worked in the video rental store in an area that was in the Lowcountry Butcher's favored hunting grounds. The butcher couldn't resist the bait. On that fateful night, he stabbed Stacy's tire with his knife, and he hid out of sight as he waited for her to drive away so he could follow her. Unbeknownst to him, Stacy checked her tires in an inconspicuous manner every night as she left the store. On that particular evening, she saw that the tire had been punctured. When she went back into the video store, she phoned the chief of police to tell him that it was time to bring this sick bastard down. The police had gotten to the previously chosen part of the road where Stacy would pull over, and they waited for the butcher to show up and attempt to begin his assault. It worked. In June of 1996, the Lowcountry Butcher was finally apprehended, and his reign of terror came to a close. The butcher was a fiendish creature of habit. The victims were all his selected type. He'd stalk them for a period of time as he learned their routines, and then he'd stab the back right tire of their car and then proceed to follow them in his car until they pulled over on the side of the road. He always chose to implement his sinister trap in the shadow of night. My mom's friend had black hair. She was thin and beautiful. She was a waitress and routinely got off of work late at night. If that kind police officer had not happened to have been driving by at exactly that moment on that night, would she have been yet another statistic of the Lowcountry Butcher? Wow, Felicity, that's really scary. The butcher was a real-life monster, I said as I scratched my chin. Yeah, Enoch, he was truly a monster. I don't think anyone shed a tear when he received the death penalty. My mom says that everyone was relieved after he was executed in the electric chair, said Felicity as the thunderstorm continued outside. Have you guys heard of the Ghoul of Junction Ridge? No, Enoch, what's that? Asked Dan. In the early 19th century, there was a series of brutal killings. Folks in the town of Junction Ridge were scared. Mutilated bodies were found in the woods. The dead bodies often had bite marks and chunks of flesh were missing. The people of Junction Ridge weren't sure if the bites were from a man or an animal. If the bite marks did come from a man, it must have been a man with a large and jagged set of teeth. Modern dentistry didn't exist then, so it would not have been peculiar for someone to have had an anomalous set of chompers. Men and women were the victims. Back in the 1800s, nobody had ever heard of the term serial killer. While death wasn't a stranger to the people of that age, a string of murders was unheard of, and the small town was on edge. Was it a bear or a wolf that had developed a taste for human flesh? Could it have been the work of a Native American tribe? Or was it the skinwalker of Native American legends? Was it a deranged man? Was it some kind of monstrous creature that stalked the woods? Nobody knew the answer. These accounts are still a mystery to this day. Maybe it was a werewolf, bro, Dan said as he rested his right hand on Christina's leg. Have you seen a lot of werewolves here? I asked while looking at Dan. You kinda resemble a werewolf after you haven't shaved for several days. Does silver hurt you when you touch it? Dan asked with a satisfied look. The only thing that hurts is my head, when I have to put up with you, pal. Everybody laughed. The laughter was interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming from the upstairs. We all went upstairs to investigate, and once again, there was no one else up there. There was no obvious explanation for what caused the sound of footsteps. Felicity still thought that the toilet that flushed by itself and the footsteps could all be explained by the fact that the house was old and creaky. On account of the scary experience that Felicity had earlier in the afternoon when their home security alarm was triggered and said some really bizarre and creepy things, I decided to keep my thoughts on the matter to myself. The heavy, thick, and unnatural feeling of the atmosphere of this house, along with the phantom footsteps, the banging sounds, the faucets that turned themselves on and off, and the toilet that flushed itself, convinced me that we were never alone in this old house. Like the alarm system told her, you are not alone. There is something in the house. You are never alone. We are always here. I hope you enjoyed your stay at the Half Moon Inn. Do come and visit us again. Until then, always remember that just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there.